Okay, here's a big one for today's deep dive. Can something as, well, practical as business, dollars, cents, supply chains, can it actually bridge the huge geopolitical gap between giants like India and China?
That's quite the question. It almost feels like a high-stakes puzzle, doesn't it? A real potential twist in how the 21st century unfolds.
It really does. I mean, you looked at these two nations, they're massive, powerful neighbors, like these sprawling estates right next door, each with enormous global ambitions.
Absolutely. And the sheer scale is just hard to wrap your head around sometimes.
Right. We're talking nearly 3 billion people combined. India's pushing 1.4 billion, China around 1.39 billion based on the latest estimate.
In the economies, China, well, it's behemoth, around $18.3 trillion.
And India's at nearly $4 trillion, $3.9 trillion, and growing incredibly fast.
But here's the thing, despite being right there, side by side, and having all this economic heft, the relationship often seems strained, just putting it mildly.
Yeah, more than just strained. You see it most clearly along that long border in the Himalayas, the line of actual control.
3,488 kilometers. And it's not exactly a clear line on a map, is it?
Not at all. It's viewed very differently by both sides. And it's not just ancient history, though the 1962 war certainly casts a long shadow. It's recent stark reality, like the Galwan Valley clash in 2020. That was tragic.
And that border friction is just sort of the visible tip of a much bigger geopolitical iceberg.
Yeah.
You've got India strengthening ties with the U.S., Japan, Australia through the Quad,
Uh-huh.
and then China pushing its huge Belt and Road Initiative, extending its influence globally. It's a complex dance of interests, sometimes overlapping, often pulling in different directions.
So the core question we're really digging into here is, can trade, can investment, economic cooperation, just the sheer force of business, can it actually act as a calming influence, a bridge over these troubled waters?
That's what we want to unpack,
Oh, you
this
got it.
mix of geopolitics and economics. We're looking for those surprising details, the insights hidden beneath the headlines.
Yeah, can commerce maybe smooth over some of those really rough edges, like, a good cup of chai on a chilly morning?
It's a nice thought. And if you just look at the trade numbers themselves, it's fascinating. A paradox, really.
How so?
Well, despite all the political tension we just talked about, the economic links are massive, and they keep growing.
They really do. Bilateral trade hit, what, a record $138 billion just last year, 2024.
That's right. And China is India's biggest trading partner. That single fact just makes you stop and think.
It does. But you mentioned a paradox.
Yeah, because when you dig into those numbers, the picture gets more complicated. India's exports to China were about $16.8 billion, things like raw materials, marine products, some chemicals.
Okay.
But imports from China, a massive $121 billion.
Whoa. That's a huge difference.
Huge. It's everything from the electronics we use, industrial machines, right down to everyday consumer goods.
So that massive gap, exports versus imports, that points to a pretty big structural issue, doesn't it? It's not balanced at all.
Not remotely. India's trade deficit with China is now over $100 billion. And this isn't just some accounting number. It creates a real strategic vulnerability for India, a dependence.
A dependence on Chinese supply chains, even as its own economy is booming.
Exactly. It's one thing to trade. It's another to be so heavily reliant on imports from a neighbor you have, well, significant political friction with.
And you see India trying to tackle this, right? Pushing for better market access in China for its own strong sectors like pharmaceuticals, IT services, certain farm goods.
They definitely want a more level playing field. Meanwhile, China looks at India's enormous, fast-growing domestic market, 1.4 billion potential customers, and sees a massive opportunity.
Yeah, for selling smartphones, solar panels, you name it, or even setting up factories there.
That's the other side of it. It feels like these two economic giants are constantly sizing each other up. Each sees opportunity, but also the risk of being dominated by the other.
And India's big Make in India push that started back in 2014, it's still a priority. That's a clear signal they want to build their own manufacturing strength and cut down on that import reliance.
Absolutely. And China's interest isn't just selling to India anymore. It's increasingly about having its big companies think Xiaomi or BYD actually set up shop in India.
Which creates jobs there, integrates them more locally.
Right. And maybe, just maybe, subtly chips away at the narrative of China being purely an external competitor or threat. It's this dynamic where economic integration could soften the geopolitical edges, but there's just so much suspicion on both sides.
Speaking of suspicion, let's circle back to that really critical point, the border, that line of actual control. 3,488 kilometers across some of the toughest terrain imaginable.
And that 2020 Galwan clash, it wasn't just symbolic. People died. It fundamentally damaged the trust, what little there was.
And you still see regular military standoffs, right? Both sides building up infrastructure, roads, tunnels, and really sensitive spots. It keeps that tension constantly simmering.
It does. And this very real, active friction raises the fundamental question. When you have such clear strategic and security worries, can business really be the main driver for calming things down?
It's a fair question. History does offer some examples where economic ties help build peace. People often point to the European Union.
Right, rising from the ashes of war, partly through economic integration. But the India-China situation feels unique, especially with that active border dispute that can and does flare up physically.
Still, you sometimes see glimpses where the economic realities seem to, well, maybe exert a little influence.
How do you mean?
Well, even after Galwan, when tensions were incredibly high, there were reports later, I think in 2024, that they agreed to resume some patrolling mechanisms along the LAC. Small steps, maybe.
Small steps, potentially. Perhaps it shows that neither side actually wants complete chaos or unpredictability. Maybe that economic interdependence, even though it's fraught, provides some incentive, however small, towards stability.
And how that interdependence plays out is key, right? Like Chinese investment in India.
Yes. Since around 2015, Chinese companies poured billions into Indian startups.
Billions. Wow.
Yeah, funding companies many people in India use every single day, food delivery apps, payment platforms, that sort of thing.
That kind of investment creates real stakes, doesn't it? A level of connection where a complete breakdown in relations would be incredibly costly for businesses on both sides.
Precisely. Neither government nor the powerful business lobbies really want to see billions in investments or those huge trade flows just vanish overnight.
India has also shown it's willing to put security first.
Absolutely. Since 2020, we've seen major crackdowns on Chinese apps and investments in India.
Over 300 apps banned, wasn't it?
Okay.
Including giants like TikTok, WeChat, citing national security. That sent a clear message.
A very clear message. And China, in response, has its own ways of making things difficult, using its complex regulations, for instance, to hinder Indian companies trying to get a foothold in the Chinese market.
So it becomes this cycle, action and reaction, economic tools used as weapons in a bigger strategic game. So if we're looking for that potential bridge, where could business realistically bring them closer? What are the actual opportunities, and where are the biggest hurdles?
Well, one really critical area is manufacturing and how global supply chains are shifting.
Ah, yes. The decoupling or de-risking idea.
Right. China's still the world's factory, no doubt.
Yeah.
But companies everywhere are looking to diversify, spread their risk, especially after the pandemic disruptions and the ongoing U.S.-China trade friction.
And India is seen as a major potential alternative.
A prime candidate. It has a huge young workforce and ambitious government programs like the Production-Linked Incentive, or PLI scheme.
That's the one offering billions in subsidies to attract manufacturers.
Exactly. Across many different sectors.
Yeah.
And they're positioning themselves to grab a bigger slice of that global manufacturing pie.
And we are seeing some results there, like Apple assembling iPhones in India now.
Yes, and big Chinese phone makers like Oppo and Vivo have set up significant production bases in India too. And this really highlights a potential core synergy. India could genuinely benefit from China's deep manufacturing know-how, its experience building vast industrial ecosystems, especially in electronics and heavy industry.
And China needs India.
China needs access to India's enormous market and its relatively cheaper labor force. On paper, you look at it, and it seems like a perfect economic match, almost inevitable.
But that lack of trust just keeps getting in the way of that seemingly natural economic logic.
It really does. India worries constantly about Chinese firms potentially dominating its own growing industries, its digital space.
And China.
China views India's push for Atmanirbhar Bharat, that self-reliant India concept, with suspicion. They see it as potentially protectionist, aimed squarely at limiting Chinese influence.
Well, maybe joint ventures could help, where risks and profits are shared, forcing them to have common goals.
That's often suggested. It could be a way to build some trust, perhaps mitigate some of that fear of dominance.
What about technology and innovation? Both countries have incredibly dynamic tech sectors, growing really fast.
Another area with huge potential on the surface. India's startup scene is booming, attracting global money. China leads the world in areas like AI, 5G, certain green technologies.
So collaboration seems obvious. Indian software skills may be combined with Chinese hardware expertise.
It could be transformative. But again, security concerns tend to trump economic opportunity. India pointedly excluded major Chinese players like Huawei from its 5G network trials.
Citing security fears, yeah.
And it's still really hard for Indian software or tech service companies to get meaningful access inside China's highly protected digital market. It feels more like a tech rivalry running alongside the economic one.
Is there any PEC area where collaboration seems more likely?
Maybe green technology. Both countries face enormous environmental challenges. Air pollution is a massive crisis in many of their big cities.
True.
So working together on developing and deploying solar, wind, or electric vehicle tech, that could align their interests in a way that's maybe less politically charged.
That makes sense. Moving beyond specific sectors, what about the big trade deals? Both are part of the Asian scene, but India famously pulled out of RCEP back in 2019.
The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership.
Hmm.
Yeah, India's main worry then was that joining RCEP, which includes China, would just flood its market with even more cheap Chinese goods and make that trade deficit even worse.
And has that view changed? Now we're in 2025 and the deficit is still huge.
Well, there's definitely renewed discussion. People are debating the potential strategic upsides of maybe reconsidering RCEP if it could genuinely force open China's market for Indian exports in return.
It sounds like a calculated risk. It would mean India's own industries have to really step up and compete, not just hide behind barriers.
Precisely. It demands competitiveness.
And beyond all the formal deals and investments, business ultimately runs on people connecting, right?
Absolutely. Economic ties aren't just spreadsheets. They involve human interaction, building understanding. You have tens of thousands of Indian students studying in China.
And lots of Chinese tourists visiting India, drawn by the history, the culture.
Exactly. And cultural exchanges, film festivals, art shows, university collaborations, they might seem small, but they subtly build familiarity. Maybe chip away at some negative stereotypes over time.
But those stereotypes and perceptions run deep, don't they? Often fueled by history or political rhetoric on both sides.
They do. It shows the challenge isn't just about economic logic. It's bridging that gap between business ties and broader trust in society. It takes deliberate effort to change those deep-seated views.
Okay, so summing up the roadblocks, they are significant, and they seem really tangled up with top-level national security and even national identity.
They really are. India is deeply suspicious of China's Belt and Road Initiative, seeing it as potential debt trap diplomacy or strategic encirclement. China, on the other hand, looks at India's strategic partnerships, like its role in the Quad, and sees it as part of an effort led by others, mainly the U.S., to contain China.
And domestic politics plays a role, too.
Definitely. Nationalistic narratives in both countries can easily flare up, using the China threat or painting India as unreliable. That makes trust building much harder.
And you can't ignore the element of, well, great power ego, maybe. Both see themselves as rising global players, deserving respect, which can make compromise feel difficult.
For sure. For that economic cooperation to really work as a bridge, both sides would need to consciously navigate all these layers: history, security fears, domestic politics, and really focus on pragmatic mutual gains instead of just competition.
And this whole dynamic, it's not just about India and China, is it? It has massive global implications.
Huge.
Right.
Think about the shifts happening in global supply chains.
Yeah.
That move to diversify away from China, partly driven by U.S.-China tensions, it's accelerating.
And India is a key place companies are looking at.
Absolutely. India, along with other nations in Asia, is a prime candidate to pick up some of that manufacturing capacity. Its sheer scale and potential workforce give it a unique advantage.
So imagine a scenario where India and China actually did manage to collaborate more deeply economically. What would that mean globally?
It could fundamentally redraw the global economic map.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine combining China's manufacturing power and infrastructure skills with India's growing market, its IT strength, its own rising manufacturing base.
That would be an economic block of unprecedented influence.
It really could be.
Yeah.
Conversely, if the tension continues, or worse, escalates, that poses a major risk to the entire global economy. Think supply chain chaos, higher costs, a much more fragmented and unstable Asia.
So business cooperation isn't just nice to have in this context.
It looks increasingly like a crucial element for global stability, actually.
Okay, so given all that complexity, how do you even start moving towards a more cooperative path? What do the sources suggest is sort of the pragmatic way forward?
Often the advice is to start small. focus on areas that are less politically sensitive. Maybe joint ventures in sectors like textiles or certain pharmaceuticals or renewable energy components, areas where the immediate security worries are lower. The idea is to build some confidence, create a track record of successful small-scale collaboration first.
Build trust bit by bit, sector by sector.
Precisely. And also establishing clear, transparent rules for trade and investment. Maybe some kind of bilateral economic council with real clout on both sides to manage disputes fairly.
What about using existing forums where they're both members?
Yes, platforms like BRICS or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. These multilateral groups focused on economics or security could offer more neutral ground for dialogue and finding common interests.
And coming back to the people element again, actively encouraging those student exchanges, cultural festivals, tourism.
Yes, absolutely. Because ultimately, relationships are built by people, not just governments or corporations. Fostering more understanding at that human level, maybe even finding ways to, share a perspective or even laugh a little despite the challenges, that can help soften the harder edges of geopolitics.
So where does this all leave us then? Is business really destined to be the bridge here, or is that hope just ultimately crushed by the weight of history and all the current tensions?
It really feels like that tightrope walk over a deep gorge you mentioned earlier. The economic pull towards closer ties is enormous.
Yeah.
The potential benefits for both countries, and frankly for the whole world, are huge.
But the risks?
The risks, the deep political mistrust, those border disputes, the strategic rivalry, they're just as significant, and they're always there. It would take a very conscious, very pragmatic effort from leaders on both sides to look beyond the immediate competition and see the potential partnership.
It really is one of the most compelling, high-stakes puzzles of our time. Will India and China find a way to actually leverage their complementary strengths?
Right.
India's demographics, its digital savvy, China's manufacturing muscle, its infrastructure prowess. Could they become this dominant economic power couple of the 21st century, rewriting the rules?
Or will they stay locked in this tense, uneasy dance? Neighbors constantly tripping over historical baggage, competing nationalisms, and that persistent friction along the border. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Will the next big headline be about conflict in the Himalayas?
Or could it be about some groundbreaking joint venture? An Indian-Chinese collaboration that gives the world something truly revolutionary. Maybe even that perfectly affordable, super reliable smartphone everyone seems to be waiting for.
It leaves you pondering, that's for sure. The stakes couldn't be higher.